The morning they discharged me from Riverside Rehabilitation Center, I had exactly $47 in my wallet, a plastic bag with the clothes I'd worn to the hospital 6 weeks earlier, and a phone that kept going straight to voicemail. I'm Chester Murphy, 64 years old, and I was sitting on a concrete bench outside those automatic doors, watching my breath fog up in the November air, calling my daughter for the 4th time that morning. Her voice, bright and recorded, told me to leave a message. I didn't. What was I supposed to say? Hi, honey, your old man's ready to come home from stroke recovery, and your husband said you're too busy to pick me up. So there I sat, watching a sparrow pick at something in the sidewalk crack, thinking how that little bird didn't need anyone to drive it anywhere. My name's Chester, and before the stroke knocked me sideways, I spent 35 years running quality control at the Ford plant in Memphis. Started there when I was 29, worked my way up from the floor. I know how things are supposed to work, and this wasn't it. My son-in-law Dale picked up on the second ring when I called their house. She's busy, he said before I could even speak. I need a ride home, Dale. They're discharging me today. I told Brenda it was Tuesday. There was this pause where I could hear a TV in the background, some show with a laugh track. We've got a lot going on right now, Chester. You should call a cab. Then he hung up, just like that. I held that phone in my lap and looked at the $47 again, as if the number might have magically changed. The nearest cab company charged a $25 minimum, and I lived 38 miles from that rehabilitation center. Even if they charged the minimum, which they wouldn't for that distance, I was looking at $60, maybe $70. I'd been doing the math since Monday when Brenda left me a short message saying they'd figure something out, then nothing. Now, I'm not a man who gets emotional easy. Growing up in rural Tennessee, my father considered crying a form of complaint, and I carried that with me through 35 years of factory work, through raising a daughter, through losing my wife, Joyce, 11 years ago to cancer. But sitting on that bench in clothes that hung loose because I'd lost 22 pounds in the hospital, I came pretty close to breaking down. The automatic doors whooshed open behind me, and this man in a gray wool coat came out and sat down on the other end of the bench. He was looking at his phone, not paying me any attention. I was trying to decide if I should go back inside and ask the front desk about some kind of assistance program when he spoke up. "Excuse me," he said. "Is your name Chester? Chester Murphy?" I looked over. He was younger than me, maybe late 40s, with one of those careful haircuts that cost more than my weekly grocery budget used to. His hands were shaking slightly, the way they do when someone's trying real hard to stay composed. "It is," I said. He stood up from the bench. "You probably don't remember me. I'm Wayne Foster. About 28 years ago, you let me sleep on your couch for 3 weeks and gave me $200 when I had nothing." I stared at him. Slowly, it came back to me, like remembering a song you haven't heard in decades, A Young Man at My Door on Elm Street, winter of 1996. My neighbor Susan had referred him, said she knew his mother from church. He'd lost his apartment and his job in the same week, and he was 20 years old and too proud for a shelter. Joyce and I had just bought our first house together, a little place where we were planning to start our family. "Wayne," I said, his composure cracked just a little. "I've thought about you and Joyce so many times over the years. I drove past your old house on Elm Street 3 years ago. Someone else lives there now. We moved after Joyce passed. Been out on Route 7 about 11 years now." He was quiet for a moment, looking at my plastic bag and the $47 I was still holding. "What's going on here?" I almost said nothing. I'm not used to answering that question, honestly. But there was something about sitting on that concrete in oversized clothes with 220s and some change that had used up all the space where my pride usually lived. So I told him about the stroke, waking up on my kitchen floor not knowing how long I'd been there. Could have been 10 minutes, could have been 2 hours. The ambulance, the emergency room, the surgery to remove the clot. Then 6 weeks at Riverside learning to walk straight and speak without slurring my words, followed by 2 weeks of outpatient therapy. I told him about Brenda, how she'd been attentive at first when the doctors were talking about brain damage and long-term care. She'd organized things, made decisions, filled out insurance paperwork. How that attention had faded over the weeks like a shirt that gets washed too many times until the colors run out. I told him about Dale, though I kept that part short. Some things you say in the right order or not at all. How he'd been helpful those first days, taking charge of paperwork, handling phone calls with the insurance company. How he'd started showing up to the hospital alone without Brenda to check on things and have me sign documents. Wayne listened without interrupting, his face getting more serious with each detail. When I finished, he asked, "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" "My house. I just need to get there. I'll drive you. You don't have to do that, Wayne." He said my name the way my wife Joyce used to when I was being unnecessarily stubborn about accepting help. "Please let me drive you, Chester." He had one of those cars that runs so quiet you forget you're moving. A newer model sedan, probably cost more than I made in 6 months back when I was working. I looked out at the Tennessee hills doing that thing they do in November when the leaves are gone and the ridge lines look like sleeping animals against the gray sky. Joyce and I had moved out here from Memphis when Brenda was 7 because we wanted her to grow up with space to run around, away from the factory smoke and city noise. "What do you do now?" I asked Wayne, realizing I'd talked for 20 minutes without asking him anything. "I'm an attorney, estate planning mostly. Trusts, asset protection, helping families protect what they've built." He smiled slightly. "I used your $200 to pay the application fee for community college and buy textbooks for my first semester. Joyce always said that money would come back around somehow. She was right. When we pulled up to my house on Route 7, Wayne got out with me. The place looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe because I'd been away for 8 weeks total. Or maybe because I was seeing it through the eyes of someone who'd just spent 2 months learning to walk and talk properly again. Wayne walked up the porch steps and waited while I found my key, my left hand still fumbling with things it used to handle without thinking. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me wrong. Closed up, stale, with a layer of dust on everything. The house had been completely shut up since before my stroke. I'd asked Brenda to check on the place, asked 3 times during my first month at Riverside. Clearly, that hadn't happened. There was mail on the floor under the slot, 8 weeks worth of it. Bills, advertisements, catalogs, everything just piled up like fallen leaves. Wayne helped me pick it up without being asked, and we stood in my front hallway sorting through it. Bills that were probably overdue, insurance paperwork, the usual junk. That's when Wayne found the envelope. It was from a law office in Nashville. I'd never heard of Hartman and Associates. Thick paper, official letterhead. The letter inside was 3 paragraphs of careful legal language, but it boiled down to this. My house was being assessed as a potential asset for placement consideration, and my daughter Brenda, acting as my designated healthcare proxy, had initiated a preliminary inquiry into guardianship options and long-term care facility placement. I read it twice, then handed it to Wayne. He read it once, and something shifted in his stillness. The way he held his shoulders changed, like a man getting ready for a fight. "Chester, when did Brenda get designated as your healthcare proxy?" "I signed papers at the hospital. First week after the stroke. They said it was standard procedure, that I needed someone who could make medical decisions if I couldn't." "And did you sign anything else? Power of attorney documents?" I thought about those early days after the stroke when my thinking was slow and cloudy, when words kept sliding past me and I had to ask nurses to repeat themselves. Dale had been there in the room, helpful and efficient, handing me papers to sign while Brenda stood by the window looking at her phone. There had been a lot of paperwork. Wayne was watching my face. I don't know exactly what I signed. I said, my head wasn't right those first 2 weeks. Dale said he was helping organize my affairs so Brenda wouldn't have to worry about it. Wayne folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "Chester, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" I looked at this man who'd slept on my pull-out couch in 1996, who'd eaten Joyce's scrambled eggs every morning for 3 weeks, who was standing in my hallway with my possibly stolen future folded in his pocket. "Yes," I said. What I didn't know yet, what Wayne would lay out for me 2 days later across my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and strong coffee, was how long this had been in the making. Dale had been patient about it, not because he was kind, but because he was waiting for the right conditions. He'd married my daughter 11 years ago, right around the time Joyce was getting sicker. Dale worked in real estate development, had his finger on property values throughout the county. He always knew what things were worth, always talked about market trends and investment opportunities at family dinners. I'd never fully trusted him, but I kept that feeling locked away in the same place I kept most of my uncomfortable thoughts. My house on Route 7 sat on 6 acres of what used to be farmland. I'd bought it from a retired tobacco farmer for $180,000 when Joyce and I moved out here 11 years ago. Recent county assessments put it at $430,000. The land was worth even more to developers because it sat right on the edge of what was becoming Nashville's outer suburban ring. I hadn't been paying attention to property values. I'd been living in my house, growing tomatoes in Joyce's garden, watching Tennessee football on Friday nights, visiting her grave at Mount Olive Cemetery every Sunday after church. Dale had been paying attention to everything else. Wayne started coming by the house daily after that first day. He'd drive up from Nashville in the evenings, usually around 6, always with a briefcase and a legal pad. We'd sit at my kitchen table, and he'd explain what he'd found in the documents he'd requested from the hospital, from the county clerk's office, from Dale's real estate firm. The durable power of attorney I'd signed was broad in scope, giving Dale significant authority over my financial decisions. It wasn't ironclad, Wayne said, but it was signed in my handwriting during a period when my cognitive function was clearly impaired. There are grounds to contest it, Wayne explained, spreading the documents across my kitchen table, especially given your medical state when it was signed and the fact that there was no independent witness who wasn't connected to your family. I sat there with my coffee going cold in front of me, looking at my own signature on papers I barely remembered signing. my handwriting but shakier than usual. The date was 3 days after my stroke, when I was still asking the nurses to repeat themselves because words kept sliding past me like water. "Does Brenda know what this means?" I asked. Wayne was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think some people who love someone complicated know less than they think they know." I'd watched Brenda love Dale for 11 years. Watched her become someone who checked with him before agreeing to things, who apologized for opinions she hadn't fully expressed yet. She used to call me every Sunday evening just to talk. That had stopped about 3 years ago. Now she called maybe once a month, and Dale was always in the background, making comments I could hear through the phone. Brenda called that afternoon while Wayne was still at the kitchen table, going through a stack of financial documents he'd somehow obtained from the county clerk's office. "How are you managing, Dad? Do you need anything? I'm doing fine. I have some help." "What kind of help?" "An old friend, an attorney. He's helping me review some paperwork." The silence on the other end had a specific quality to it. The silence of someone realizing a situation they thought they controlled had developed an element they didn't plan for. "Dad, you don't need an attorney. You just need to focus on getting your strength back." "I'm focused on my recovery. This is part of it," she asked, if she could come over the next day. I said yes because she was my daughter and I'd been saying yes to her for 36 years, even when my gut told me otherwise. She came alone. I noticed that immediately, no Dale, which meant she'd either chosen to come without him or he'd decided not to show up. She looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her, which was 3 weeks into my rehab stay for a visit that lasted exactly 45 minutes. She looked tired, like someone who hadn't been sleeping well for months. Wayne made himself scarce when she arrived, took his laptop and papers to the back porch. He said he had calls to make, which was probably true, but I think he also understood that some conversations a father needs to have with his daughter without a witness. We sat at the kitchen table where Joyce used to serve Sunday dinner for 10 years before she got too sick to cook. I put coffee in front of Brenda because that's what you do. It's what my mother did and her mother before her. You put coffee in front of people as a way of saying you see them and you're not going anywhere, no matter what needs to be said. She wrapped her hands around the mug and started talking. It came out in pieces, overlapping, sometimes going back to clarify something she'd said 5 minutes earlier. She talked about the fear after my stroke, how everything had happened so fast. The ambulance, the emergency room, doctors using words like massive and potential brain damage. She talked about Dale stepping in, handling the insurance paperwork, dealing with the hospital administrators. How it had been a relief in those first days to have someone who knew what to do with forms and phone calls and medical billing. She hadn't read everything she signed, she said. She'd trusted Dale to read it and explain what was necessary. She hadn't understood what the power of attorney meant. Thought it was just so he could handle insurance claims while she was at work. She hadn't known about the letter from the Nashville law office until I told her about it on the phone. I watched her face as she said these things. I've known that face since it was red and crumpled and furious as a newborn baby. I know when she's lying and when she's not. She wasn't lying. She was something more complicated than a liar. She was a person who'd loved someone for 11 years and built her entire understanding of herself around that love. Now she was sitting in her dead mother's kitchen, beginning to see the architecture of that love clearly for the first time, and what she was seeing frightened her. He told me the lawyer's letter was routine, she said. He said every family with an elderly parent in a medical situation needs to consider long-term care options. I'm 64 years old, Brenda. I had a stroke. I'm not incompetent. She flinched. Not at the word incompetent, but at the recognition behind it. I know, Dad. Something shifted in her face then, and for just a moment she almost smiled. And in that almost smile, I saw the girl who used to ride on my shoulders at the county fair and argue with me about whether the Titans were ever going to win another playoff game. I know, she said again, softer this time. Wayne came back inside after another hour. Brenda shook his hand and looked at him with the careful expression of someone recalibrating everything they thought they understood. He walked her through what he'd found in the documents, speaking in the flat, clear language of a man who'd spent 20 years in courtrooms, explaining complicated things to worried people. She asked good questions, sharp questions, the kind that told me she was someone who, given complete information, could think clearly and make sound decisions. I'd always known that about her. I'd watched it get slowly, quietly suppressed over 11 years of marriage, and sitting there watching it come back was one of the better things I'd seen in a long time. Dale called 3 times during that 2-hour meeting. Each time, Brenda looked at the phone and let it go to voicemail. What followed wasn't one dramatic moment like you see in movies. It was smaller things accumulating like snow, imperceptible at first, then undeniable. Wayne filed papers to contest the power of attorney on the grounds of cognitive impairment at signing and undue influence. He worked with a paralegal named Karen Thompson, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in elder abuse cases. During the legal discovery process, Wayne found other things. A second mortgage inquiry had been made on my property without my knowledge, using the power of attorney Dale had obtained. The inquiry was dated just 2 weeks after I'd signed the documents in the hospital. A title company Dale had used for previous transactions was facing licensing complaints in Davidson County for irregular documentation practices. The Nashville law office that had sent me the letter wasn't an elder law firm at all. Hartman and Associates handled property transfers and real estate development. They'd processed 2 previous transactions for Dale in recent years, including a property he'd flipped after obtaining power of attorney from another elderly client's family. None of this was hidden exactly. It was perfectly visible to someone who knew where to look and perfectly invisible to someone who trusted the person standing between them and the paperwork. Brenda moved into my guest room 2 weeks after that kitchen table meeting. She said it was temporary while she figured things out. I made up the room with fresh sheets that had been Joyce's, the good ones she'd saved for company. Fresh sheets in a clean room, saying without words that you're welcome here and you're safe. Dale called me directly once during this period. The call lasted 4 minutes. He was measured at first using his real estate voice. Then he got less careful. He said I was being ungrateful, which I found interesting given the actual direction of what had happened. He said I'd turned my daughter against him. Wayne Foster drove 38 miles to pick me up from a rehab center because 28 years ago, I let him sleep on my couch for 3 weeks, I told him. Make of that what you will. He hung up. Wayne and I fell into a routine during those weeks. He'd drive up from Nashville on weekends, usually with takeout barbecue. We'd watch Tennessee football with the volume up too loud because we're both hard of hearing in exactly the same frequency range, which we discovered and found unreasonably funny. He was careful with Brenda during those weekends, respectful. The way you're careful with someone who's healing from something that goes deeper than what shows on the surface. She was doing the slow work of separating what she actually believed from what she'd been taught to believe over 11 years. One Saturday evening in December, the 3 of us were at the kitchen table after dinner, and Brenda looked at Wayne and said, "Why are you doing all of this? You don't owe my father anything." Wayne thought about it for a moment. In 1996, I was 20 years old, and I'd just lost my apartment and my job in the same week. It was January. I had $30 in a duffel bag. Susan Miller told me there was a man on Elm Street who might be able to help. He paused. "I knocked on your father's door, expecting maybe a phone number for a shelter. He opened the door, took one look at me, standing there in the cold, and said, 'Come inside.' Your mother had the couch made up before I could explain what had happened." Brenda looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was small. "He didn't ask what I'd done wrong to end up there," Wayne continued. "Didn't make me prove I deserved help. He just said, 'You can stay until you get back on your feet,' and went back to watching TV. Like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world. So no, I don't owe your father anything," Wayne said. "But I choose to be here. There's a difference." The legal matter was resolved in February. The power of attorney was successfully contested. The assessment inquiry into my property went nowhere without legal authority to support it. Dale retained his own attorney, formal letters were exchanged, then silence that settled into something permanent. Brenda filed for divorce in March. I didn't celebrate this. There's nothing to celebrate in the unwinding of 11 years of someone's life. She cried for weeks, not just for the marriage ending, but for recognizing what the marriage had actually been. I sat with her through it because I learned from Joyce that sitting with someone's grief isn't the same as endorsing it. She found an apartment in April, 15 minutes away. She came for dinner twice a week and called every other day. Slowly across the spring, I began to see the volume of her personality turn back up. Opinions expressed fully, laughter that didn't check itself, willingness to disagree with me about the titans that I'd missed more than I'd realized. Wayne filed the final documents on my property, then took me to dinner at Murphy's Steakhouse to celebrate. "I want to pay you for all this work," I told him. "I'm going to say what you said to me in 1996, he replied. "Don't be stupid." I laughed, real laughter, the kind that comes from your chest. "I didn't say that to you." "No, but you would have if I'd tried to pay you back." Wayne started calling Sunday evenings after that, which had been Joyce's time for 30 years. We talked about work and tomatoes and whatever game had been on. Sometimes Brenda called after he did, and I'd tell her what we'd talked about. She'd say, "You two are ridiculous," in the tone that means she's glad. In May, Wayne called about opening a satellite office in the county for estate planning. "I have a room," I said. "The front room gets good light. Chester, that's your house. It's my house with a room that gets good light. My father let people use the barn when they needed it. A room's less than a barn. By summer, there was a modest sign at the end of my driveway. Twice a week, older couples came through my front gate, some in good clothes, some in work clothes, sometimes younger people who looked worried about protecting what they'd built or inherited. I don't tell this story to make myself into something I'm not. In 1996, I had a couch, and Joyce had extra sheets, and a young man was cold. Nothing heroic about it, just ordinary decency most of us manage when the cost is low enough and the need is plain enough. But I've thought since my stroke about how ordinary decency compounds across time. How a couch in January becomes a law degree, becomes a man in a gray coat sitting on a bench because an old man's face was familiar. Joyce believed kindness was a form of faith that doing right in the small moment matters, even when you can't see how. The point isn't to get it back, she told me once. The point is to be the kind of person who gives it. I'm 64 years old. I have 6 acres that belong to me and a daughter whose volume is turned back up where it belongs. I have Wayne Foster, who calls Sunday evenings and drove 38 miles to pick me up because 28 years ago I said, "Come inside. It's cold." I have a chosen family built from choices made across years. The choice to open a door in January. The choice to make up a couch with clean sheets. The choice to sit at a kitchen table until the thing is figured out. Tell them it doesn't have to be big. I told Brenda when she asked what people should take from this. A couch, a couple $100s, fresh sheets. It's the small things that travel farthest because they're the ones people actually carry. Sometimes the best investment you can make is in a stranger's tomorrow because you never know when your own tomorrow will need a stranger's kindness. The difference between surviving and living isn't what happens to you, it's whether you choose to pass on the decency you received or the bitterness you earned.